While this video is likely going to come out in May, I'm still counting it as an addition to Favorite Anime April. If you were unaware, basically, with one glaring exception, every video I've made in April has been to the tune of a series I consider to be among my personal favorites. And I couldn't rightfully cap this whole thing off without talking about Hunter x Hunter. And more specifically, I want to discuss one of my favorite fights from the series, that being the Dodgeball match during the Greed Island arc. And I'll say this right now, just because this fight is one of my favorites, doesn't mean I think it's the best one in the series, okay? What it is, though, is a hell of a fun time that I will gladly sit down and watch any day of the week. And I'd like to take some time to explain why. So let's do this. This Dodgeball match is an interesting fight for a number of reasons. For one, despite taking 3 episodes to complete, it isn't the climax of the arc. What's more is that Razor and his crew aren't really direct antagonists either. To compare it to a game, which only seems appropriate, they were more akin to a mini-boss. Like Big Octo in the Ocarina of Time, they were just an entity within the dungeon that our players needed to overcome to progress. They themselves had no goal they hoped to achieve from the match aside from preventing the players from making that progress. Likewise, it's only once our players have made it through a chunk of this mini-boss that its final and strongest phase is revealed in the form of Razor. Now yes, one could assume that he's the strongest just by his imposing figure and the fact that he's the leader, but I love how it's conveyed. There's no prior internal monologue about how he seems like he's the most trouble or anything like that from our characters. He's introduced lifting weights, and then at a moment's notice, he pops Bobobo's head like it's a freaking water balloon with a ball of Nen. It's an immediate and effective show of strength complemented by striking animation. And given that his game of choice is revealed to be Dodgeball, we immediately know what we're in for before the fight has even begun. And once it does, it doesn't take too long for us to be reminded as Razor likewise decapitates the abominable snowman shortly into the match. This guy really has a thing for headshots, huh? Regardless, before we go more in depth with the Dodgeball match itself, I just want to touch on another reason why this fight is unique even within the world of Hunter x Hunter. It's mainly because it's a battle taking place inside a sport with very specific rules on top of the rules that Nen already abides by. It makes the fight that much more cerebral. Though to be fair, the majority of fights in Hunter x Hunter are of a similar nature, even before the introduction of Nen. It's something that makes each one a joy to watch because they rarely come down to who can punch the hardest. And here, these rules serve to put limitations on how the players can fight. There's no direct contact after all, they're mainly alternating between 2 moves, throwing and dodging. But as is often the case, limitation breeds creativity, and I think on multiple fronts this fight is a great example of that. Within the match itself, there are of course the different strategies for how to apply your Nen in the game, be it Hisoka's bungee gum, or this guy switching Razor with one of his beasts at the last second to get a cheap shot in. Such tactics, along with Nen just making the dodgeball feel like it's made of brick, keep the combat from ever feeling stale or repetitive, while still keeping the stakes of the game high. And just like how the combat stays varied, so too does the animation. You'd think that sooner or later Madhouse would run out of ways to make a dodgeball throw look badass. But you'd be wrong. In total, there are roughly 17 distinct shots of balls being thrown. I say roughly because, well, it depends if you count, say, these passes, but even then, none of the animation is reused, and there are more cuts here than most shows would probably have. Either way, the animation for the majority of these throws or hits does a phenomenal job of communicating the sheer amount of kinetic force behind them, especially whenever Razor has his hands on the ball. Nearly every one of his big throws are made up of at least 2 independent shots, with one normally dedicated to showing that he's stepping into his throw. Because anyone who knows how to throw anything halfway competently knows this is how you get the most power out of it. And it shows, as Razor easily has the biggest exaggerations when it comes to his throwing animations. The same goes for his balls. I meant dodgeballs, just to be clear. The way they both contort and warp, you feel the force behind every windup and release. And so do the characters. Boy, do they ever. That's because the second half of selling these shots is showing the damage that they do. I've already mentioned some, but we also have Hisoka getting pushed back by the force of a throw despite cushioning it with bungee gum, and my personal favorite, when Gon literally gets knocked out of his boots after taking a shot straight to the head. And I love this one in particular because we're given multiple metrics for measuring the strength of that ball. There's the initial impact, the ball getting lodged in the ceiling as a result, Gon tumbling backwards and impacting the wall hard enough to damage it, and the fact that he has a bloody forehead despite using Ko and protecting that area with his hands. Gon himself is of course unfazed, and while he has taken quite a beating, he's still capable of dishing it out too. This briefly goes back to what I said about making dodgeball throws look badass, because despite Gon essentially launching the same attack 3 times in this fight, each instance is decidedly more epic than the last, culminating in his final punch that, well, we'll get to that in just a bit. But first, I want to take a moment, much like the anime does, and talk about this part. Amidst the ongoing battle and the ever-dwindling hope, the music fades as Gon channels his aura. Soon, all that can be heard is the sound of his breath and then his nen. As it grows, the music slowly fades back in as he readies himself for the punch. The crafting of this sequence is incredible. I especially love the dirt gently flying off the rafters here as Gon's nen increases. That combined with the flickering lights as the camera work becomes more and more turbulent gives you an idea of just how much energy Gon is channeling into his fist. Now, I do have one gripe with this sequence, although it is admittedly a small one. Part of me wishes that this buildup had been put in tandem with his final punch instead of his second one. I know it's a very, very minor nitpick, and there are completely valid reasons for having it where it is, but personally, I think the sequence feels much more so like Gon used every last bit of aura compared to his final punch. That being said, everything else about his last attempt is near perfect. The animation is fluid and stunning as the production team continues to one-up themselves throughout this fight. The strength of this punch is so masterfully, holding on the impact for 33 frames, and then within 4 the ball is off-screen as we cut to this gorgeous shot of Gon and his follow-through. Yeah, eat your heart out, Goku. But as much as this demonstrates the speed and force of the ball, it's this next exchange that makes it even better. Because this is Gon literally giving it his all, and yet Razor still manages to deflect it back at him. In most fights, this last second twist might be countered by a similar move from our protagonist, pulling out one last miracle hurrah to seal the victory. In this exchange, that twist technically exists, but not really, because as the ball is launched back towards Gon, we see him pass out because he actually did put every last drop of stamina into that punch. And as Razor correctly points out, had he been conscious, Gon very well would have tried anything in his still remaining power to pull out the win in a way that wasn't dodging. Instead though, we get probably the best example in this entire fight of just how fast one of these balls is traveling. The focus in this sequence is put on Gon collapsing and the significance behind that, but I want to point out the fact that said collapse is still a direct continuation from his follow-through. So, accounting for the anime trope of characters talking at roughly twice the speed of light, that means this entire travel time of the ball back and forth, including Razor's deflection, was less than a second. There are plenty of tactics to convey speed through animation, but the multiple ways that Hunter x Hunter does so in this scene is simply fantastic. And we're not done just yet, because as I said, few fights in Hunter x Hunter come down to a simple matter of strength, and this one, despite being a sport, is no different. Hisoka decides to catch the ball in Gon's stead by using bungee gum. He then breaks his remaining fingers in order to redirect the ball back once more in another series of shots where the camera work expertly displays the force of the projectile. The ball collides with Razor as he is content to continue rallying when suddenly, Razor is forced to take the full strength of the throw as he is forced out of bounds for the win. And I love even the little details after this fight is over. Remember what I said about Razor always leading with his foot during a throw? Well, the choice to show that now primes you to notice his feet in these shots. You see the skid marks obviously, but also the fact that Razor completely wore out the toes on one of his shoes in an effort to resist that last volley from Hisoka. Speaking of which, there's one last thing I want to mention regarding everyone's favorite fight sexual murder clown. This last move of his is, I'll say, incredibly interesting to me given what we know about him, because Hisoka is known to do what will garner him the most pleasure. So it's not out of character for him to want the match to keep going per se, but when it's paired with his word choice of it feels as though this might very well be a genuine moment of selflessness from Hisoka, because Gon is out cold and they could have just as easily had his line be something like, "I'm simply having too much fun," or "I can't let it end just yet." Instead, he seems to be speaking to both himself and Gon in this moment. It might be out of respect for him, or maybe it can be brushed off as Hisoka being his classic wildcard self. I don't know, and I'm not gonna say definitively one way or another. What I do know though, is that this was one hell of a fun fight. I watched it several times in a row looking for bits I wanted to highlight, and each time I enjoyed myself. It continually escalates and finds inventive ways for our characters to fight given their restrained environment, culminating in what is the perfect mini-boss before they take on the big bad of this arc. It's just a good time, plain and simple. I didn't really mention that this fight also underscores Gon and Killua's friendship, because, well, that's pretty much spelled out in the anime. That said, it does contribute to keeping this fight emotionally grounded and satisfying on that level. Otherwise, it certainly would have felt more detached compared to other fights from the series. But instead, it ends up being the icing on what is a very delicious cake within the world of Hunter x Hunter. It's the perfect fight for this arc, and I hope I've shown why it's one of my favorites in the series. But those are just my thoughts, and I encourage you to share your own. Did you enjoy it? What's your favorite fight from Hunter x Hunter? What about in general? I'm talking any medium. Whatever your opinions are, I look forward to reading them in the comments down below. As always though, thanks for watching, and an especially big thanks goes out to my awesome patrons, PenguinPandaZero, OverjoyedSoup, MVPino, James Morton, Mr. Idealist, and everyone else for generously supporting me. If you would like to join those awesome people, you can click on the right to visit my Patreon page, click the left to subscribe, and that bell icon is there. I'm contractually obligated to at least mention its existence, so yeah, click it if you want. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.